Have you wondered what the last US fighter to be built with a gun as its primary weapon system? How did they transition from gun platform to missile systems? Welcome back to the Jaxom Talks channel, where today we will discuss the last of the gunfighters, the Vought F-8 Crusader. In the early 1950s, the United States Navy was facing an existential crisis. The Korean War had just concluded, and the results for naval aviation were, at best, mixed. While the Grumman F-9F Panther and the McDonnell F-2H Banshee had performed admirably in the ground attack role, they were fundamentally subsonic aircraft. When they encountered the Soviet-built MiG-15 over MiG Alley, they were outclassed in speed, climb rate, and altitude. The Navy quickly realized, if it was to survive as a relevant arm of American military power, it needed a carrier-based fighter that could not just match but exceed the performance of land-based interceptors. The challenge was immense. To fly at supersonic speeds, a plane needed thin, swept-back wings, but to land on a pitching carrier deck in the middle of the ocean, a plane needed high lift, low-speed stability. These two requirements are aerodynamically opposed. In 1952, the Navy issued a requirement for a new day fighter. It had to reach Mach 1.2 at 30,000 feet, climb like a rocket, and have a landing speed of no more than 100 knots. Most aviation firms thought it was impossible. Vought, a company with a pedigree of building difficult but brilliant aircraft like the F8 Crusader, decided to prove them wrong. The man behind the Crusader was John Russell Clark. He understood that to make a supersonic jet that was carrier-capable, he couldn't just use flaps and slats. He needed a radical structural solution. His answer was the variable-incidence wing. This is the defining feature of the F8. Instead of the pilot having to pitch the entire nose of the aircraft up to high angles to create lift for landing, which would completely block the pilot's view of the carrier deck, this meant that the wing itself would need to pivot. This was achieved by raising the leading edge of the wing by 7 degrees. The wing achieved the necessary angle of attack while the fuselage remained relatively level. This gave the pilot a clear view of the meatball landing system and allowed for a much slower, safer approach. Vought combined this wing with the Pratt & Whitney J57P11 afterburning turbojet. In order to manage the massive airflow required for supersonic flight, Clark designed the Gator chin intake. It was both simple, rugged, but also a highly effective solution. On March 25, 1955, the XF-HU-1 took its maiden flight with the test pilot John Conrad at the controls. It didn't just meet the requirements. It went supersonic on its very first flight. The Navy knew they had a winner. The Crusader entered service at a time when records were meant to be broken. In 1956, the F8U-1 set a national speed record of 1,015 miles per hour, the first time a standard production aircraft had flown over 1,000 miles per hour. But the most famous demonstration of the Crusader's speed came in 1957 with Project Bullet. A young Marine major named John Glenn, who would later become the first American to orbit the Earth, was selected to fly an F8U-1P from Los Angeles to New York. The goal was to average supersonic speeds across the entire United States. Glenn pushed the aircraft to its limits, requiring 3 mid-air refuelings from AJ-2 Savage tankers. He completed the coast-to-coast journey in 3 hours, 23 minutes and 8 seconds. When he landed, the aircraft was missing several rivets from the heat and stress of the flight, but it was intact. The Crusader had proven that it wasn't just a prototype. It was a reliable, long-range supersonic weapon. So why do we call it the last of the gunfighters? To understand that, we have to look at the philosophy of the 1950s. This was the missile age. The Air Force was developing the F-102 Delta Dagger and the F-106 Delta Dart, which didn't even have internal guns. They were designed to fire nuclear-tipped rockets at Soviet bombers. The Navy, however, perhaps due to its more traditionalist culture, insisted that the Crusader retain a knife-fighting capability. It was armed with 4 20mm Colt Mark 12 cannons located in the lower fuselage. These guns were capable of firing 1,000 rounds per minute each. However, being the last of the gunfighters was often a title of irony. The Mark 12 cannons were temperamental. The ammunition feed system was prone to jamming under high G loads, exactly when you needed the guns most. During the Vietnam War, many pilots would maneuver perfectly onto a MiG's tail, pull the trigger and hear nothing but a thud as the guns jammed. Despite this, the F-8 was the last American fighter designed where the gun was considered the primary weapon, rather than an afterthought or an emergency backup. The cockpit was another story. It was cramped, even by the standards of the day. Pilots didn't get into a Crusader, they strapped it on. The visibility was excellent due to the raised canopy, but the workload was immense. The F-8 was a clear weather day fighter. It lacked a sophisticated radar for long-range intercepts, meaning the pilot had to rely on his eyes and his hands. The F-8 was not a forgiving aircraft. Its narrow-track landing gear made it unstable on a rolling carrier deck. If a pilot came in at too slow a speed, the wing would stall violently. If they came in too hot, the aircraft would bounce, often leading to a catastrophic bolter or a ramp strike. Transitioning from a trainer like the Buckeye to the F-8 was a jump in performance that many young pilots couldn't handle. You had to stay ahead of the airplane at all times. If you fell behind the power curve, the J-57 engine, while powerful, took time to spool up. By the time you had the thrust you needed, you were already in the water. Interestingly, the F-8 found a second home with the French Navy. The French carriers Clemenceau and Foch were smaller than American supercarriers. The Crusader was the only supersonic fighter that could operate from them. The French loved the Crusader so much they kept their F-8P variants in service until 1999, nearly 25 years after the US Navy had moved on to the F-14 Tomcat. Now, while the fighter pilots were getting the glory, another group of Crusader pilots was performing the most dangerous missions in the Navy. This tasking was the photo-reconnaissance pilots of the RF-8. The RF-8 was unarmed. No guns, no missiles. Its only defense was its speed and the pilot's nerves. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, RF-8As from VF-62 flew low-level missions over Cuba in order to photograph Soviet missile sites. They flew on the deck, often at treetop level to avoid radar. They managed to bring back the smoking gun that President Kennedy used to confront Khrushchev. In Vietnam, the RF-8 was equally vital. These pilots had a saying, unarmed and unafraid. They would fly over a target after a strike to assess the damage, meaning the North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gunners were already awake, alert, and very angry. The RF-8 suffered the highest loss rate of any Crusader variant. This was because they had to fly straight and level to get clear photos even while the enemy was shooting at them. When the air war over North Vietnam began in earnest with Operation Rolling Thunder in 1965, the F-8 Crusader was the Navy's premier dogfighter. While the F-4 Phantom II was faster and carried more missiles, the F-8 was more maneuverable. The North Vietnamese Air Force primarily used the MiG-17 and the MiG-21. The MiG-17 was a subsonic but incredibly agile fighter that could outturn almost anything in the American inventory. The F-8 was the only American jet that could hang with a MiG-17 in a horizontal turning fight. On June 12, 1966, Commander Harold Halmar of VF-211 scored the first F-8 kill. He engaged a flight of MiG-17s, and after a frantic dogfight, he downed one with a Sidewinder. This set the tone for the Crusaders' service in the war. The F-8 pilots developed a culture of aggression. This was simply because their aircraft was a single-seat fighter. They didn't have a radar intercept officer like the Phantom. It was one man against the world. They relied on basic fighter maneuvers, the art of using energy, gravity, and geometry to get behind an opponent. By the end of the war, the Crusader had established a 19-to-3 kill ratio. Of those 19 kills, 16 were MiG-17s and 3 were MiG-21s. While the F-4 Phantom would eventually score more total kills, the Crusader's kill-to-loss ratio remained the best of the war for any US aircraft. There is a kind of irony in the last of the Gunfighters moniker. Out of those 19 confirmed kills in Vietnam, only one was achieved solely with the 20mm cannons. Most were achieved with the AIM-9 Sidewinder. The problem was the Mark 12 cannon itself. It was a derivative of a Second World War design, and it wasn't suited for the high-G environment of supersonic jet combat. When an F-8 pilot pulled 5 or 6 Gs in a turn to get a lead on a MiG, the belt-fed ammunition system would often kink. The gun would fire a few rounds and then jam. In one famous engagement, a pilot named Phil Wood found himself on the tail of a MiG-17. He had a perfect tracking solution. He squeezed the trigger, and all 4 guns jammed instantly. He was forced to break off and use a Sidewinder. This happened repeatedly. The gunfighter was often a fighter without a working gun. Yet the mindset of the gunfighter, the willingness to get close, to see the enemy pilot's goggles, is what made the F-8 so successful. Let's go back to the engineering for a moment. The F-80's wing was a masterpiece of 50s mechanical computing. When the pilot pulled the handle to raise the wing, a massive screw jack actuator physically lifted the front. This transformed a thin, supersonic wing into a high-lift curved wing. Furthermore, the F-8 didn't have conventional ailerons for roll control at high speeds. Instead, it used small drooping ailerons and used the tail surfaces for much of its maneuverability. The entire horizontal stabilizer was a single piece. This was because at Mach 1, traditional elevators lose their effectiveness because of the shock waves. The slab tail solves this by moving the entire surface. Operating the F-8 from a carrier was an exercise in controlled violence. Because the F-8 sat so low to the ground, the intake was only a few feet off the deck. This made it a vacuum cleaner for any debris on the carrier deck. A single stray bolt sucked into a J-57 engine would turn a multi-million-dollar fighter into a very expensive paperweight. The catapult launch was equally intense, because the F-8 was so light and powerful. The shot from the cat would accelerate the pilot from 0 to 150 miles per hour in about 2 seconds. Pilots used to report that the G-force was so high it would momentarily blur their vision. Once in the air, the F-8 was a joy to fly provided you were moving fast. At low speeds, it was a beast. If you had an engine failure on takeoff, the F-8 had the glide ratio of a manhole cover. You didn't try to fly it into the water. You ejected immediately. One of the most incredible stories of the F-8's ruggedness occurred in 1960. A pilot took off from Naples in Italy and forgot to spread his wings. The F-8 had folding wings for carrier storage. He realized his mistake when he was already in the air. Most planes would have crashed immediately. The F-8, however, had enough power and enough lift from its fuselage and the remaining wing surface that the pilot was able to fly a circuit and land safely with his wings still folded. It is a testament to the sheer over-engineering of the Vought design. Now, throughout the 1960s, a rivalry existed between the F-8 community and the F-4 community. The Phantom was the big iron. It had 2 engines, 2 seats, a massive radar, and a payload that could rival a Second World War heavy bomber. It was the future, the dawn of the multi-role fighter. The Crusader was the last of the breed. It was a specialist. It did one thing. It killed other airplanes in visual combat. F-8 pilots often looked down on Phantom pilots as bus drivers who relied on their radar and their missiles. There was a famous patch worn by F-8 pilots that said, F-8 Crusader, 1 circle, 1 kill. It referred to the fact that if a MiG got into a 1-circle turning fight with a Crusader, the MiG was going to lose. However, by the late 1960s, the Navy realized that the F-8's time was drawing to a close. The lack of a sophisticated radar meant the F-8 couldn't operate in all weather conditions or conduct beyond visual range intercepts. Its problem was that the Phantom could, as the war in Vietnam escalated and the need for night fighting and heavy strike capability grew, the F-8 was slowly relegated to the smaller Essex-class carriers that couldn't handle the heavier Phantom. As the F-8 aged, Vought tried to keep it relevant. The F-8D and F-8E models introduced a limited all-weather capability and the ability to carry bullpup air-to-ground missiles. They even added a hump on the back of the F-8E, so it could house more electronics. There was even a proposal for an F-8U3 Super Crusader. This would have been a completely different beast. It was larger, faster and featured large ventral fins that folded down for high-speed stability. It competed against the F-4H-1 for the Navy's next-generation fighter contract. In a fly-off, the Super Crusader actually outperformed the Phantom in many categories, particularly maneuverability and climb rate. However, the Navy chose the Phantom because it had 2 engines and a second crew member to manage the complex radar. The Super Crusader was cancelled. The 5 prototypes were handed over to NASA for high-speed flight testing. To this day, many F-8 enthusiasts wonder what if the Super Crusader had been the one to go into production. By the mid-1970s, the F-8 was being phased out of the US Navy. The arrival of the Grumman F-14 Tomcat, the big fighter, that combined both the maneuverability of the F-8 with a greater radar than even the F-4 marked the end. The last F-8 fighter squadron, VF-191, was disestablished in 1976. The Crusader RFA tree conversions lasted a bit longer, serving until 1982 with the Naval Reserve. But the Crusader's service didn't end there. In the Philippines, the Air Force operated F-8Hs until 1988. In France, the Aeronaval continued to fly the F-8P. They were finally retired in 1999, replaced by the Dassault Rafale. When the last French Crusader touched down, it ended 44 years of continuous service for a first-generation supersonic jet that is an unheard-of lifespan. So what is the legacy of the Vought F-8 Crusader? It was the jet that bridged the gap between the seat of the pants dogfighting of World War II and the high-tech missile-dominated warfare of the modern era. It was a machine that required a level of pilot skill that has largely been replaced by fly-by-wire computers and automated flight control systems. You were flying a plane that wanted to kill you on the landing but would protect you in the fight. It was an aircraft of contradictions. It had a unique variable-incidence wing that was a mechanical nightmare, but a simple chin intake that was a model of efficiency. It was the last of the Gunfighters, yet scored most of its kills with missiles. When you see an F-8 today in a museum with its massive air intake and its wings tilted up in that aggressive ready-for-landing posture, you aren't just looking at a piece of Cold War hardware. The Crusader didn't just fly, it snarled. It didn't just fight, it dominated. In the history of naval aviation, there are planes that are more famous, and planes that stayed in service longer, but there will never be another plane with the soul of the Crusader. The Vought F-8 Crusader remains a towering figure in the annals of military history. It was the right plane at the right time for a navy that needed to prove it could fight in the supersonic age. From the high-altitude dash of Project Bullet to the low-level unarmed and unafraid runs over Hanoi, the Crusader did everything that was asked of it, and it did it with a style and a ferocity that has never been matched. I hope you have enjoyed this look into the Crusader. Make sure to check out our other videos. Hit the like, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment and activate the bell so that you don't miss future episodes. Thanks for joining me on this dive into the history and service of the F8, and I will see you next time.